Afternoon. Welcome to this event sponsored by the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Jim Capretta. I'm a senior fellow here at AEI. I am pleased to welcome those who are watching online and those in attendance today to our event on improving federal agency performance through budgetary reforms. Sounds so dry, but of course it is exciting and actually very, very important because the performance of these agencies at the federal level affects every American in some way or another, and the public deserves high-performing public service. And this is a particular aspect of how to achieve that, maybe what's holding it back, and an expert who can help us navigate and think through the budget process and how it potentially could be changed from an impediment in too many cases to something that could catalyze better performance. So let me get to it. More specifically, we'll be looking at a new report authored by our guest, Dr. Steve Redburn, entitled Opportunities for Management When Budgeting. Catch that, the OMB in there, which was published by the IBM Center for the Business of Government and the Shared Services Leadership Coalition, which advocates for cross-agency service improvements through various initiatives. The new report looks at how the process for developing federal agency budgets and then also how they are executed after approval by Congress might change to incentivize continuous performance improvements. After I introduce Steve, he will have an opportunity to make some introductory comments about the report and some of the main themes and findings that he and a group that looked at this topic came up with. And then he and I will engage in a discussion based on a series of questions that I will pose. With about 5 minutes left, I will turn to a small number of audience questions that we receive perhaps from those here in the audience, or alternatively, for those who are watching online, you can send your questions in also. You have two ways of doing that. You can send an email to our able assistant, Jack Rowing. His email is jack.rowing@aei.org, and rowing is spelled like in rowing the boat. The spelling of this email address is also on our event webpage. Alternatively, you can send your questions to Jack via the former social network called Twitter by using the hashtag AskAEIEcon. Okay, so now to Steve. Dr. Steve Redburn is a professorial lecturer at George Washington University's Trachtenberg School of Public Policy. He is recognized both in the U.S. and abroad as an expert on budget process and government management challenges, and is in demand as a distinguished lecturer, budget advisor, and authority on government budgeting, management challenges, and public policy. He built his expertise during a 25-year career as a senior government official at the Office of Management and Budget, where I also served twice, and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Previously, he was a study director for the National Academy of Sciences and a project director for the National Academy of Public Administration. He earned his PhD in political science from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, still in the tournament, the basketball tournament, and a BA from Pennsylvania State University. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Redburn to our event, and please proceed with whatever comments you have.
Thanks, Jim, for having me. Sure. It's a pleasure to talk about my favorite subject, the federal budget process. I think depending on where you are on the nerd spectrum, your level of interest is higher or lower, but I think in this town, a lot of people are interested in that process. I've thought a lot about it since I worked at OMB. But in this report, it focused particularly on the extent to which the budget process is or can be supportive of better management of the federal government. The federal government is probably the most complex organization human beings have ever created. It's not the largest, but it's certainly complex. And it's difficult to manage. When I worked at OMB, we spent a lot of time as a career staff supporting the president. I worked for 4 different presidents. We worked on management. Management is OMB's middle name, so we spent a lot of time thinking about how programs should work and could work better. But of course, in the executive branch, the budget process tends to dominate attention, especially of senior people at OMB and in the agencies. It's sometimes hard to find room in that process to focus on some of the management requirements that are necessary to make the government function and to achieve the many missions that Congress gives the executive branch. So in this report, a major source of the ideas is a roundtable that was held last October with some of the people who've been leaders in trying to improve the management of the federal government or in the budget process. Both groups came together. Collectively, they represent centuries of expertise in federal management. And they shared the view that the federal government is in danger of falling farther and farther behind the technology frontier, let's call it, where the best private large organizations operate. That technology is a heavy contributor to federal management necessarily, but a lot of the systems that are used are archaic or obsolete, or they're not well integrated, so that a lot of opportunities are lost. Not only that, but as new technology becomes available at seemingly a faster pace, people have to say AI, for example, artificial intelligence, AI 6 times a day now, I think. The gap seems to widen between what is possible with technology and what the federal government is which tends to be sluggish in adopting new technologies, is able to do. And a major focus of decision-making on investments in new technology and in the workforce is the federal budget process. So in this report, the people in the roundtable threw ideas out for how do we improve the budget process support for federal management. That's the essence of what they talked about. And a lot of their ideas are in the report. We looked at all stages. We looked first at the development of the president's budget, and then at the Congressional review and appropriation stage, and finally budget execution. So we considered all 3 stages of the budget process and analyzed some of the problems at each stage for those who want to improve management. For example, the budget process is organized like the government, mostly around by agency and program by program. There's really few opportunities in the process as it has worked in recent years to consider government-wide management improvements. As a result, even though there's a well-developed set of routines in the executive branch with a statutory framework for improving performance, there's not much attention paid to opportunities to invest in technologies that maybe could be shared by multiple agencies or could be used government-wide to support mission delivery by agencies that may have similar problems. Credit agencies or agencies that are grant-making agencies have similar problems. They need to have shared solutions, but there's no, in the budget process typically, relatively little attention is paid to those opportunities because of the way it's organized in the executive branch. In this, just to be brief, in the legislative phase of things, the Congress spends more time on the budget than legislative branches in any other democracy, by far. I mean, the president's budget for the fiscal year we're in now went up last February. It was just enacted more than a year later, so they had a year. If you look at parliaments in other democracies, they have a few weeks, perhaps, or a few days. And often they are rubber stamping the government's proposals. And Congress takes great interest in the details of where the money is going to be spent, how it's going to be spent. So if you look at the appropriations language, it's much more detailed and prescriptive than in other countries. So we're really an extreme outlier, both in the amount of time that the Congress takes and the amount of attention to detail and the amount of control that they exert over the executive branch, which kind of blurs accountability then for the results that I know they're interested in achieving. And then in budget execution, because of all these detailed requirements, that reinforces the executive's natural tendency to be good at compliance, but not necessarily good at agility and innovation. So that's a handicap. So we spent some time thinking about how do you make the executive branch more agile if Congress is willing to allow it the freedom to manage with greater flexibility. So that's sort of a quick overview of some of the things in the report.
Yeah, terrific. That's a good way to get us started. You mentioned, of course, that there are these 3 phases, right? The OMB executive branch budget process, they send it up to the Congress. Congress goes about its business deciding how to do it. And then, of course, the decision's made in Congress, and then you have to spend the money at the agency level. So there's an execution process. All 3 seem to have some barriers, so to speak, to kind of getting at some of the investments that might actually pay off big down the road. Maybe let's talk a little bit about each phase, just a little bit more detail for an audience that doesn't necessarily know how all these things work. Just a little bit about, especially since you spent so much time with OMB, you know, an agency comes forward and they say to OMB folks, hey, it's clear that if we just had $25 million more in IT money, we could really do better down the road. Why? You know, sometimes those things are approved, but sometimes people say, well, wait a second, you know, how do we save money down? What are some of the impediments to making that happen? And maybe talk through a little bit about that kind of an example.
Sure. Well, the first impediment might be, in the present period, the overall cap on spending that has been enacted through statute. We have Fiscal Responsibility Act that has set caps on appropriations in particular for this year and next year. So there's a constraint there. And then this is true in the legislative part of the process as well. The funding decisions tend to prioritize first the highest priority programs, keeping those going, and then any initiatives that, say, the president, in the case of the president's budget, the president wants new initiatives, so that's additional on top of what it takes to keep things going. And so and those are high visibility items with strong constituencies typically. There's not much constituency for a new system that might make a program work better. So you can roll out a big new initiative and you discover, oh, well, we should probably build the system to support the public's use of that program, but we didn't prioritize that. So those things tend to get lost in the mix.
Isn't there an element also, though, just following up, of the agencies and the subcommittees that they're working with, also with OMB, there's an element of very protective of the programs in their jurisdiction and very siloed decision making. So anything that has spillover effects that benefit outside of the immediate confines of their budget, they tend to be suspicious about. Is that not true?
I think they're protective of their budgets. First of all, each agency develops its budget proposals and brings them to OMB in the fall for review, and that's mostly the way the process is organized.
Right.
There could be, you could imagine, a comprehensive government-wide management review that says, what are the major investments we need to make to bring the federal government closer to the modern era and its ability to perform, to transform the way it interacts with citizens and customers, and to take advantage of things like artificial intelligence that would perhaps provide an entirely different way of governing. Those things don't get attention because the process is, as you said, siloed and organized agency by agency, program by program, and when the reviews are done in OMB, typically they're done agency by agency. Yeah.
Just as an example, I was thinking as I read your report and as our conversation going, I mean, if you had a small business out there that was had a CEO and they said, look, if he or she says we can find a lot of profitability down the road if we invest $10 million today in this new technology that'll make our customer service improve a lot. They tend to find the money somewhere, $10 million, invest it, and improve their performance 3, 4, 5 years down the road. There's a short-sightedness, is there not? That's also, a little myopia going on here. That we'll get to 3 or 4 years down the road. First of all, an elected member of Congress may or may not be there. and the budget situation may be very different. We'll worry about tomorrow. Is that part of what's going on here?
I think so, yes. The part of the budget that funds the investments we're talking about is the discretionary part of the budget, the annually appropriated part of the budget. And the appropriations process is 1 year at a time, and there's a cap. And it's all allocated out to subcommittees that are responsible for individual agencies and programs. There is no reserve held back either in the executive branch by the president when they propose the budget or in the congressional phase of the process for management improvements that might involve many agencies sharing the same solution, for example.
Right. Let's talk about that a little bit too, because I think many people may not be aware of some of the developments that have occurred in the last 10 and 15 years around some of these management innovations that are nascent and relatively small, but potentially could be much bigger if these kinds of budgeting ideas were taken seriously and moved forward. One being something I didn't know that much about, but I read a lot about in your report and other places subsequently, was the Technology Modernization Fund, as it already exists and was created a few years ago. And then also the whole shared services initiatives that have been sort of, I think, started in the Obama administration and it's continued on. Even the Trump administration tried to accelerate that kind of thinking so that agencies paid a central repository for some of the services they might usually do internally.
Central provider of that particular service.
Talk a little bit about how these two things have kind
Okay.
of come about.
The
Because I think they might affect how this capital investment goes forward.
Yeah, the Technology Modernization Fund is a process solution to what we've been talking about partly. Congress provided initially a small amount of money and then $1 billion as part of the recovery from the pandemic legislation to capitalize this fund, which is administered by the executive branch internally. They run a competition. OMB and GSA run the competition. They have criteria for financing projects, and agencies compete for that funding. And they can come in together for a shared services project, for example. But even with $1 billion, it's almost all now committed one way or another. And I think a lot of the expectations initially were perhaps too high for this. First of all, even $1 billion is not a large amount relative to the gap that we've been talking about in technology. But also, there was an expectation that if you invest in new technology that would generate administrative efficiencies, there'd be a stream of savings that could come back to this fund, what could be a revolving fund, and be available quickly for reinvestment in other improvements. And that was perhaps over-optimistic. It takes a while for these savings, if they occur, to materialize, and then it's hard to capture them in the accounting and also hard to capture them from an agency that doesn't want to give them back to a central fund. So it may not work quite as well as expected, but it's an attempt to avoid the problem of just having one small amount of money each year in appropriations for an individual agency. Shared services, which can be funded through Technology Modernization Fund, is an operational solution where multiple agencies can use the same provider of a service. So we have shared services for cybersecurity investments. We have them for grant management. So we have a lot of grant-making agencies that engage similar routines for competitive or formula grants every year. And the idea is to build a common system so that people don't have to apply separately. Well, they may have to apply separately for each program, but there's a common application so that once they fill out that application, their information is now available to all the agencies that might fund some of their activities, different streams of funding. There's financial management, human resources management. These are all common back office, you might call them back office or support functions. In a private organization, often these are centralized to some degree. But in the government, the effort to create shared services has been less centrally directed. It's been more voluntary, and it's been emerging gradually over several administrations. It's not clear how fast that can occur.
Yeah, right. Just to kind of put a fine point on this, some of this operational back office cost that's part of the federal enterprise. It's mentioned in this study and other previous studies looking at management questions for the federal government, that the typical private sector standard is maybe 15%, and overhead's not quite the right word, but the cost of running the enterprise, in a sense, with all these sort of centralized back office concepts, maybe 15% of their total bill. In the federal government, it looks like it's probably 30%, something like that. So there is seemingly some room here to make a big transformative leap toward, a higher performing enterprise.
It's hard to quantify the expectations here.
Yeah.
Partly it's because government operates differently than the private sector. They're constrained by what they're allowed to do by law, whereas the private sector, unless you're prohibited from doing something, you can generally try to do it. And it's in a fishbowl. Everybody's looking at it constantly. And it's not, the priority is not necessarily efficiency. Sometimes it's equity or serving a particular constituency, veterans or somebody else. So it's not clear how much you could actually squeeze out of that 30%, if that's the right number.
Right.
Yeah.
Got it. Going into more of some of these particular ideas, I like the way the report was organized. It had sort of incremental ideas, medium-sized ideas, and then the ones I like the best are always the big ideas, that'll never happen, right? Things that might actually make big breakthrough concepts, shake things up a little bit more. I don't know if you have them off the top of your head, but I have a couple of, one being, how about even in OMB, and then perhaps mirrored also in the Congressional side. Why not create a sort of a new entity that's sort of like the central repository entity for big management initiatives, capital fund for improving government performance, and almost have a separate appropriations item for that. And then also at the appropriations subcommittee level, maybe there's a 13th subcommittee, maybe that's the unlucky number, but the 13th subcommittee that would be sort of capital investments for cross-agency performance. Yeah. Are these ideas that are just so foreign that our process can't get our mind around it?
I don't think so. It helps to look at other countries that do have a central capital planning process for their capital needs. I don't think OMB, which is a small agency with too much to do already, could actually manage that. Yeah. But it could be centralized, and they could centrally direct it.
You could also hand it off to GSA or some other central agency, I suppose.
And in the appropriations process, there are a number of barriers which we haven't talked about in that process to funding management improvements, starting with the fact that there are these programs under a capped environment with strong constituencies that have to get funding politically before you can think about an increment for management. But also the scorekeeping rules, which require, and this has been true for a number of years, the full budget authority for a capital project be provided in a single year up front, even if it might take 5 or 10 years to fully execute that capital project. So that's a big lump of budget authority within a cap that is already squeezed, and it's hard to find room for that. And then there's no credit given to the appropriators for the out-year savings. They're just scored 1 year at a time for their 1 year of action, and there's no way for them to capture the present value of a stream of efficiency savings as a credit in the scorekeeping that CBO does during the process. So there are a number of barriers that they face.
Yeah. This maybe comes back to the Technology Modernization Fund. You mentioned this is about the capturing the savings, which I think is a key concept because people are going to say, well, if we keep investing in these capital improvements and the federal government says, well, down the road it's going to pay off big, and the payoff is never measured or nobody can ever see it.
Right.
It makes them suspicious about the initial investment in the first place, right?
How do you create an
How do you
incentive?
create some kind of structure? If the Technology Modernization Fund didn't do it, is there another way? First of all, I don't even understand, can't quite get my mind around agencies saying after they got the money, oh, never mind, there is no return on this money, we're not going to pay you. Seems like that should have been negotiated up front and prevented against, but maybe it was attempted and there was a second thoughts after the fact.
It's sometimes hard to identify the stream of savings.
Yeah.
There's not a color to that money.
Is there a solution to this incentive return on investment problem, or is it just an unsolvable one?
One way to lengthen the horizons of decision makers is to have, say, biennial appropriations, or give agencies 2 years to obligate all their administrative money, so even if it's appropriated for a single year. Or maybe even better, let them keep money that's left over at the end of the year, gives them an incentive to operate efficiently in the current year, and then put that into their own capital fund, which could be a revolving fund to invest in efficiencies down the road.
Right.
So there are mechanisms like that that could be used in addition to scoring the present value of future savings, which CBO tends to be skeptical of, Congressional Budget Office, so does OMB.
Maybe with some history
Yeah.
for the skepticism, but I mean, I think this is the key. One of the key things is how to kind of create the incentive so that a central investment authority says, here, yeah, we got a great investment opportunity here. Let's give you the money. You're going to work with these specialists, invest in a new IT system, and then the return gets somehow shared with everybody involved in making the decision. Or it gets allocated in a way where everybody's happy that they made that investment. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I guess I think that's still the thing to be worked out. I know the agency would say, well, we'll give you better customer service. I think a lot of people might say down the road, well, what about the taxpayers? Is there a way of getting the money so costs come down over time? That kind of thing.
Well, one idea in the report for Congress is to have a management scorecard, say a 10-year scorecard, that's analogous to the pay-as-you-go scorecard that's for budget investments on the mandatory side of the budget and for taxes.
Yeah.
And GAO, in its work in particular, creates a menu every year of actionable, scorable efficiency savings. So I think there's 5,000 current open recommendations from GAO reports, and they estimate that you could save $100 to $200 billion if you did all the things they recommended, if the agencies did all the things they recommended. So that Congress could take that menu and they could put in the budget resolution or in a separate management resolution that's the responsibility of the management oversight committees in the House and the Senate, a menu of things, and direct the appropriators to enact those savings proposals or provide an allocation to the full appropriations committee to use that way. So there are mechanisms like that that could be created that would change the incentives and lengthen the horizons of the decision makers to some degree, although I'm somewhat skeptical of Congress's ability to do these kinds of things because they haven't done it in the past and because of the way that institutionally they tend to focus on they're elected from individual districts or states, and they tend to focus on the needs of those individual districts and states, and they're good at that, but they're not really good necessarily at being responsible for a well thought through, integrated, strategic approach to using resources.
Yeah. I do think there might be an opportunity. I definitely agree with your general characterization of that congressional process. The one slight exception is one of the places in Congress that has somewhat of a longer term view, just because the folks tend to be there a long time. A lot of institutional memory. Parties change control, but the people often are the same, kind of players. Is the appropriations subcommittee process. In other words, you tend to have appropriations subcommittees that have jurisdiction over some of these agencies where the people on the Hill tend to work there 10, 15, 20 years, and they've seen a lot of stuff come and go. And maybe some of them can be brought around to thinking through some of these capital, doing capital investments a little bit differently, because they're going to be sitting in that same chair, maybe in the minority of the majority, but in the same chair, 5 or 10 years later, staffing, a chairman or a ranking member, still, doing the same kind of thing. And they do have an interest, a lot of them, I think, in long-term viability of the agencies they oversee. Is that something you picked up in the roundtable? Is there a little bit of institutional connection there?
I think the staff is not necessarily the problem. Again, I think the institution is run by the members, of course, and the staff's going to be responsive to them. But I would also point out that the executive branch has massively more analytical resources than the Congress does. So when the president produces a budget, that's the result of an enormous amount of analytical talent being brought to bear over a period of months to produce something that's well thought through and strategic and answers the charges given in legislation from Congress. Congress can't duplicate that. So while they go through the motions of trying to produce a budget using the 1974 Act, which is celebrating its 50th birthday this year, they don't really have the substance behind that, and they don't have the staffing. They can get a lot of help on management stuff from GAO. So I think I would point to them as a useful resource. Yeah. And they also are institutionally capable of thinking strategically, and they do a great job of that.
Yeah. Let's talk about another innovation that has been out there, and actually an interesting idea that came forward in the, it was done, I think, at the career level, but advanced in one of the president's budgets during the Trump administration by one of your former colleagues, one of my former colleagues. And that's the idea for something called a federal capital revolving fund, a little bit similar to the technology modernization fund. It was written to be kind of an amendment to the CAP process in the Congress for capital investments, trying to look at things, I think, when I read about it and I saw the reference in the report, it was really trying to say a lot of states have something like this, where they do capital budgeting differently from operational, near-term budgeting. How would this capital revolving fund work, and what could it do to help this process?
So the proposal you're talking about is actually an attempt to solve the scorekeeping problem that we identified of lumpiness of budget authority, because it all has to be funded up front for the appropriators, which would make it easier for them to fund these projects without getting too technical. That's what that was about. Yeah. A revolving fund, a government-wide revolving fund, would be a bigger lift, but other countries have central capital planning processes, as I said before, and funding. The question is, how would that be organized, managed, and would Congress be willing to give up that degree of control over time to the executive?
Right. Related to all of this is the idea of centralization and talent and technology. Obviously, much of what we're talking about is big IT projects, and of course AI looms in the background of all of that. And the federal government doesn't have a great, it's done some things well, but it's not without its blemishes over the last 25 years in terms of trying to do a big project in various corners of the government that have kind of run aground for a variety of reasons. They usually muddle through and get to an end point, but sometimes they change contractors and other things happen. Is there a talent problem at the federal level? Is there a personnel problem? Is there just an expertise problem? I think a lot about the healthcare.gov website initial crashing.
Yeah, that was
but then they got it up and running, pretty short order 2 months later, when different people were brought in. So the question is how can the federal government do some of this big capital IT investments better? I know that wasn't really a direct subject of your report, but is that something that...
Yeah, there are people here who could answer that question better than I. Certainly, there's a lot of talent in the private sector that can find its way into the federal government. Jennifer Palka has written about this sort of thing. And some of those people are eager to come in and help, and they've done so. But it's still difficult to retain people of that caliber over a long period of time. So probably the best solution is likely to be a partnership between the best private corporations with the technical expertise and government, which then sort of specifies this is the task, this is our problem, and rather than telling the private sector build this system, ask them to come up with a technical solution that takes advantage of the best technology.
Yeah, right. That's interesting. With the big ideas that were in the report, on the appropriation side, we talked about maybe just sort of a central, 13th subcommittee. Mm-hmm. What would be some of the big ideas on the execution side, which we haven't talked quite as much about? Is there some new way of taking the budget authority? Maybe it's the shared services initiative.
That's one idea, and that's probably low-hanging fruit. That should be fairly easy. We already have established small quality service management offices, QSMOs are called.
Got to have an acronym, QSMOs.
That's right, that broker shared solutions for multiple agencies.
What's an example of one of those?
Well, the one that most interesting to me is the grants management one, but it's also the newest, and it doesn't have the track record of some of the others. As I said, that a lot of what the federal government does, it doesn't deliver directly, but it makes a grant to state or local agency or nonprofit or researcher, and they do the work, and so they are the ones in contact with the public. But there's a complex apparatus that is siloed for making these grants. And when you have a problem that a local community is trying to grapple with, it cuts across all of these boundaries, like homelessness, for example. They are the ones that have to sort of integrate these different streams of funding and so on. So the idea of a shared service here would be to make their task eventually much easier. And from the agency's perspective also, instead of having to develop their own systems to manage their own grants, they would have a central system that many of them could share, because they have similar functions for awarding and then getting reports and audits and so on.
Just to take that one step further, let's assume it is homelessness and it's a shared services grant-making operation. I think in the way the federal government now is running that idea, they're thinking about HHS being the shared services management entity.
They're the lead, yeah.
And HUD maybe would pay HHS to help them manage grants in the homeless area, maybe with some of the HHS money also coupling with the homeless money from HUD. Is that how this would work?
It could work like that, but I think there has to also be a change in authority that allows local communities to solve problems by pulling these threads together themselves. So if they want to do something,
so the money would come in together.
Yeah, they want to pool money and use it flexibly to solve the problem based on local conditions. They can do that. Right now, they can't. They have to. All of the incentives are vertical to comply with the requirements of each grant program separately, and all the systems are aligned that way as well.
Very good. Well, there's a million questions we can get into, and I still have several here, but I want to make sure we turn to any questions that the audience might have here or online. I guess we don't have any yet. Anybody here in the audience with a question? Yes, sir. Wait for the mic, please, and also just introduce yourself if you don't mind.
I'm Gerald Chandler. The systems that you're talking about, are they mostly commercial systems? Or are they homegrown within the department? And if they're commercial systems, aren't they the vendors trying real hard to get you to buy new ones?
Yes, they're mostly commercial, and the vendors are very interested in selling to the federal government. There are obstacles to using the procurement process that have to be overcome. So while the federal government is a huge customer and therefore potentially a very lucrative market, it's also a tough market for vendors to deal with. Barriers.
Very good. Yes. Please introduce yourself. Everybody will know who you are.
I'm Mark Foreman. OMB manages by 4 policy areas, you having run one of those areas. Congress has 12. And I'm just wondering, if you move to 4 appropriations committees, do you get some of that look across common services? Does that help? Or Are there too few appropriations committees? And if we went to more subcommittees, maybe things would move faster. Where do you sit on that?
I have an opinion, but I'm not the invited guest expert, so I'm going to defer to Steve here and see what he says.
All right. I don't know if it's the number. I think it's partly the way they're organized. They're somewhat random collections of agencies that are in a particular subcommittee. And they don't have a mechanism for easily coordinating their work. Now, you may, in your experience, have seen it differently, but for example, for border security, Homeland Security has a lot of the responsibility, and that's one subcommittee, but then the Department of Justice has administrative law judges, courts, or a third subcommittee. They're all involved in the process of handling people who come across the border undocumented and trying to figure out what to do. And if there are more Border Patrol agencies funded by this one subcommittee, that might create a problem for these other entities that, as the flow downstream to them increases. So there needs to be some coordinating mechanism. I don't think it's something you can just solve by rearranging the pieces. I think there has to be a different process.
Yeah. In just to give you a little bit of my sense of my experience overseeing some of these budgets in OMB and working in the Congress is that you end up with sort of two arguments around these things. One being that the more centralization and cross-cutting that these things get, the more you might be able to say, well, we're going to invite a solution that can be applied in a number of places. Everybody has a cybersecurity problem, so why are we funding little dinky cybersecurity budgets in 12 places? Why don't we have one expert investment going to do better cybersecurity across 10 agencies, right? Yeah. That's true, and there's always been efforts to do that, and that's part of our challenge, I think. Yeah. The flip side of that is the agencies then come forward and say to the Appropriations Subcommittee, one of their 12, they say to them, you know, you're making me go over to this agency. They don't care about our people in our program. They're completely got a different idea and mission, and they don't understand us. They don't have our history and our tradition, and you know what I'm saying. The kind of a culture around the agency gets developed, and they don't trust that someone else will do cybersecurity well for them. So then I'm just saying those are the two. That's the culture clash that goes on now. Cybersecurity being a good example here, I think, of something that ought to be done more cross-agency. Because
it's an example where there's been some progress.
I'd love to hear that.
Under a statute that essentially mandates that part of DHS take responsibility, not only for cyber threats to the federal systems, but private sector as well, collaborate to share information very quickly to deal with those threats. And they are the seat of the CUSMO for cybersecurity. So there's some clout and statutory authority behind and budget behind the effort to.
I'm glad
so
to
it
hear
actually
that.
Works much better. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. But anyway, I was trying to give you a sense of why there's it's difficult to get there because the agencies will go to the Congress and their patrons in the Congress and say, nobody understands us but us.
That's right. We're unique.
We're unique, and we have our own problems and our own culture and our own constituencies that we got to serve. That's right. And if we hand off some of our budget to some other agency to deliver this service, they'll do a poor job.
Or we just can't take the risk that something might fail over there and we can't reach out.
And they're not accountable, and we're accountable.
And they have a point.
They have a point, exactly. Yes, I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Great, thank you. My name is Victoria Wasmer, and I'm curious because this is always a challenge in a shared services type of model, and thinking about the CUSMOs, really I'm also thinking about the federal line of business, and it's something that agencies and departments have to put in. It's sort of like, we'll call it a tax that's related to a set of services that are being provided centrally. And I always think that there needs to be like an overemphasis on the customer experience. In this instance, the department and the agencies that are receiving those services from a centralized source. And how do you get the incentives right? Because in essence, it's a sort of forced monopoly. And I am always sort of struck by the challenges because folks say, hey, you don't understand our unique challenges here. What are the ways that you structure a centralized mechanism to understand the user experience and the customer experience and the tailoring that needs to happen in terms of service levels?
I'll let Steve try to answer that difficult question.
That's not a budget question. That's a management question. Victoria, it's good to see you. I don't know if there is an answer. I think you've specified the problem. I don't think there's a simple answer to that question. But there has to be a balance between centralization and the distinct missions and interests of each program and agency, and that it does require sensitivity to the customers of the central provider of that service, or flexibility in the way they tailor it to the needs of each agency.
My guess is that there are some things that are really sensitive because they're customer related, public facing things. And then there are things that are a little less sensitive because they're kind of back office stuff that maybe can be handled more, centrally. Like, first of all, real estate management in the federal government is complicated and messy. And every agency says they want to own their own building and so on and so forth. It may be that they don't really need to own their own building, and it may be they don't need their own processing for payroll. And there's a lot of things that have already been solved, but they could probably all be done a little bit better. So I think we'll close there. We're just at time. Please join me in thanking Steve for coming to AEI today.